My name is James R. Bryant II, and this presentation will be a critique on Cartesian skepticism. The presentation is titled, That Which is Necessary for Doubt, Stowaway Faculties and Determining Influences in Cartesian Skepticism. René Descartes is hailed by some as the father of modern philosophy. This is largely because he redefined the process of metaphysical analysis and ushered in a new paradigm of thought. While his philosophy is widely celebrated even today in the field of academic philosophy, his work is not without flaws. Drawing out these flaws has been the source of much philosophical advancement in the postmodern era, and will be the goal of this examination. The focus of the examination will be on Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. This analysis will consist of 3 parts, the first of which will be dedicated to framing the discussion by describing the steps of Descartes' philosophical process. The second will be composed of objections to assumptions made by Descartes in the process just mentioned. The third section will include philosophical insight from various authors on concepts including, but not limited to, that of knowledge, intellect, reason, and judgment. The primary goals of this analysis are as follows: to demonstrate that it is not possible to reduce the conscious self down to thought alone, to critically analyze Descartes' attempt to do so, to identify particular faculties necessary for doubt which Descartes assumes are immovable from the conscious self, and show how these components influence our cognitive ability to reason and make judgments in a way that undermines the central goals of Cartesian skepticism. Finally, to illustrate that these unobserved elements influence our worldview in ways that are extremely relevant to epistemological philosophy. In the second meditation, Descartes takes up and readdresses doubts that he had mentioned in the first meditation. Descartes seeks to better understand the I that is the conscious self, that which is actually doing the doubting. What he finds is that as long as there is a doubter doing the doubting, the one truth that cannot be eliminated is that the doubter must undeniably exist. This assertion, though, does nothing more to inform regarding its qualities or capacities. In other words, it tells us nothing of its essence. To overcome this deficiency, Descartes seeks to, quote, subtract anything capable of being weakened, even minimally, so that what is left at the end may be exactly and only what is certain and unshakable. The next logical step, Descartes thought, was to suppose that because the body and sense perception can sometimes be unreliable or mistaken about the world as we perceive them, that these elements must be removed from the conception of self. Believing that he has successfully reduced the conscious self down to the most basic level, that is, thought alone, Descartes seeks to make judgments about the remaining thing, the self, apart from body, sense perception, or any other doubtable element. Now that I have established the basics of Cartesian skepticism, I'll move on to the objections section. The objections will be addressed in the same order that the corresponding steps have been introduced, that is, as they are enumerated on the slide. If we recall the first step, it is to reject the body, and along with it all sense perception of the external world. The mistake with this approach lies in the refutation of all sensory experience. We shall, for the sake of argument, assume that the first part is correct. A body is necessary for sense perception. However, the attempt to separate the conscious self from the body, as Descartes suggests, does not negate all previous sense perception. This poses a serious question. Would Descartes have us believe that sense perception is in the body only, and now that there is no body, the sensory perception has left our intellectual recollection? If we say yes, then we are now without any sense experiences, which are necessary for judgment. Aristotle recognized the importance of sense experience in our ability to understand the world. He states that, quote, we cannot employ induction if we lack sense experience, because it is sense perception that apprehends particulars. With no memory of sense experience, we cannot make the kind of determinations necessary for judgment. If we say no to this question, which I believe we must, then we have not accomplished what Descartes has set out to do. We must conclude from this that even were it possible to consider the conscious self apart from a material body, sense perception remains, at least residually, through memory. The second objection involves the ability to reflect. Descartes claims that upon reflection, the intellect thinks of itself. In regards to this, he says, quote, I am mind, or intelligence, or reason. And he goes on to say that these are, quote, words whose meaning I have been ignorant of until now. But how, one might ask, came these things to be so named? If the intellect exists alone, there would be no language to inform the inquirer of the proper words. It seems that in order to answer this question, the questioner, or observing intellect, would have to carry with it some knowledge and some basic assumptions about the validity of that knowledge. This deficiency is noted by K.T. Gallagher, who builds upon notions from R.J. Hurst, and affirms that all language is, quote, tainted with pre-established meanings and assumptions. It appears, then, that there is more that is carried along with the intellect throughout this process. In addition to sense experience, we now have knowledge and language, and along with these, the built-in assumptions that accompany each. The third objection is concerning the ability to make judgments. The first judgment should be to confirm the status of the first and second steps described above. This is so that we are assured of the ability to discern the true metaphysical properties of the self, without doubt, mistake, or deception. This is where the more serious deficiencies in Descartes' philosophy manifest. First, it should be noted that every process preceding this step involved the employment of doubt and then judgment. This is another mistake in judgment pointed out by Gallagher. He asserts that both doubt and judgment require pre-established notions of truth and consistency about the world. Not only that, but those notions are determined by the subject's dynamic relationship to the world. These are all exactly the kinds of elements that Descartes had supposed removed from the intellectual inquirer. Another modern philosopher, Immanuel Kant, would also find fault in Descartes' use of judgment. In Kant's critical philosophy, he points out that there is an important distinction between types of judgment. There is that which is given to us in simple observation, and these are judgments which are explicative and add no new knowledge about what is observed. Other judgments are ampliative, those which offer greater meaning than what is merely given in experience. These are synthetic judgments. Descartes treated the former as though they were the latter, that is, as though able to offer epistemological insight into the conscious self. He does this even though they are only observations about states of affairs. To make a synthetic judgment, according to Kant, requires, quote, the combination and addition of various representations one to another. If we have not but intellect, stripped of all external influences, as Descartes would have us assume, then there is no other with which the lonely I can be conjoined to form a synthetic judgment. Pure concepts alone, removed from their meaningful place in the material world, give us no actual metaphysical knowledge. What has been demonstrated here so far is that there are undeniably stowaway faculties that must accompany the intellectual inquirer throughout the process of Cartesian skepticism. This is because the faculties of sense perception, language, and knowledge are all elements required for doubt. But these stowaway faculties themselves are accompanied by stowaway determining influences. The presence of these influences undermine everything Descartes hoped to accomplish with Cartesian skepticism in establishing an undoubtable self, completely apart from the material world and all that can be doubted. It should also be noted that these determining influences, because of the way they affect our knowledge and reason, are part of an infinite circular relationship. As we gain more knowledge about the world, for example, This will influence our worldview, which will alter the way that we investigate and think about our observations. What this signifies is that Cartesian skepticism cannot be accomplished without considerable bias. First, we are still relying on sense experience, which Descartes has made explicitly clear is subject to doubt because it is a thing about which we may be mistaken. Second, we have made use of terminology in identifying our faculties and in naming them, both of which require foreknowledge and pre-established language. These factors inevitably influence our thought and reason, and therefore serve in determining our knowledge of self and of the world, even if only slightly. Again, this is, according to Gallagher, because our language is laden with pre-established meanings and assumptions. Third, and worst of all, every factor mentioned above is predicated upon a framework of assumptions. We operate under the assumption that our preconceived notions about the world are correct and that our biased worldview permits adequate sensory experience to grasp the world as it is given. What has been demonstrated here proves that no product of Cartesian skepticism is actually beyond doubt. The arguments contained in this analysis do not require that we abandon entirely the idea of attaining a concept of self, or of an objective world, only that we must cede that our conceptions of these will always contain some bias. With these new insights, it is clear that any attempt to strip down the self to the most basic thinking I would be to neglect all that informs that I of itself. The self is attainable, however, through our sensibilities. According to Merleau-Ponty, precisely because perception, in its vital implications and prior to any theoretical thought, is presented as perception of a being, it is not considered necessary for reflection to undertake a genealogy of being. What this means is that perception is not a faculty to be stripped away. Rather, it is the natural starting point for our inquiry. With no need of further justification or reflection as to the origin of our faculties of judgment, phenomenology allows us to fully accomplish what Descartes could not. On this matter, Merleau-Ponty states, quote, "The whole life of consciousness is characterized by the tendency to posit objects, since it is consciousness, that is to say, self-knowledge, only insofar as it takes hold of itself and draws itself together in an identifiable object. Hopefully, it has been adequately proven that the conscious self cannot be reduced to thought alone. Descartes made this mistake because he misunderstood perception and our conscious relationship to it. This analysis has broken down the core components of Cartesian skepticism to show that it cannot sufficiently accomplish its ends without considerable bias. It has also been argued that these biases influence judgment and reason in ways that completely undermine the overall goal of Cartesian skepticism. Also, faculties required for doubt have been established and shown to be inseparable from the conscious self. These contributory factors impede our ability to gain knowledge of the external material world only if we deny them. Alternatively, we can embrace subjective sense experience and recognize that language and foreknowledge are determining factors from which we cannot be divorced. These stowaway faculties, which are required for judgment, reason, and doubt, cannot be ours without bias. It should be understood from the arguments here that metaphysical knowledge about the self and about the world must be gleaned from the adoption of these stowaway faculties and determining influences into our intellectual calculus. It is through the recognition of such influences that we are able to achieve a more accurate picture of the conscious self, which will make possible epistemological assertions about the world. All of these stowaway faculties and determining influences alter our perception of the world and therefore our epistemological understanding. Because of the way that we are bound up in the world, so too is our knowledge of it. The arguments here affirm the idea that to understand the world metaphysically, we must first understand ourselves phenomenologically. This presentation should be considered the intellectual property of the sole author James Richard Bryant II. I would like to offer my thanks to the Department of Philosophy at Holy Apostles College and Seminary, and a special thanks to Dr. Yates as the guiding inspiration behind the research and critical observations of this analysis. Thank you.